Thank you, choir. Thank you, Nancy. Good morning. Wow, the crowd has grown from 25 to somewhat. We are in our second Sunday of Great Meals of the Bible. And last week, Pastor Dave, just in glancing, mentioned some meals. And he mentioned one that is a weird one. And that is Elijah being fed by ravens. Have you ever read that story? Let me recap for you what happened. Jezebel was a Phoenician, lived by the Mediterranean Sea. And she married the king of the northern kingdom of Israel called Ahab. Remember, under David, under his two grandsons, the kingdom split into north and south. And the north, they distanced themselves from the worship of God. And when Jezebel married Ahab, she brought her Phoenician gods, her fertility gods of Baal and Asherah, and they replaced God, Yahweh, as the official religion. And with that, they killed the prophets of God, and only one was left, Elijah. God then sent Elijah to the two of them and said, "As surely God will withhold the rain. It will not rain for 3.5 years, and your crops will die." Of course, they made Elijah office a bit cuckoo. He left until the winter rains didn't come, and there were no crops. And again, the winter rains didn't come, and there were no crops. And the drought set in. Meanwhile, God had to go hide Elijah and took him to a wadi, a dry riverbed on the other side of the Jordan River, where he lived for 2 years. And at night, the ravens would come and drop pieces of meat and pieces of bread, and he would drink from the water from the brook. Now, what type of bird is a raven? Scavenger. Aha. What type of meat do they scavenge? Roadkill. Yeah, there was no such thing as expiration date back then. I mean, this is the first precursor to Meals on Wheels and Amazon Fresh. At night, they drop the meat, they drop the bread, and he drinks the water. If you have a New Year's resolution of losing weight, this is the perfect diet. I mean, regurgitated raven food and agua. You lose so much weight. But it went drier. And even the brook dried up, and the drought affected Elijah. And God said, "I want you to move. I need you to go somewhere else." And we pick up the story in verse 8 of 1 Kings chapter 17. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, saying, "Go now to Zarephath," which is in Hebrew a smelting place or a place of testing, where you will be purified through fire, which belongs to Sidon, and live there, for I have commanded a widow there to feed you. Now, if I were Elijah, and God says to me, "Leave your place of safety and go to the unknown," I'd have so many questions like, "God, did you check the Garmin? Do you know where this place actually is? I couldn't find it. It's so small. And when I finally found it, it's 100 miles away. How am I supposed to get there? Have you thought about me walking through the desert and all Jezebel's spies seeing me? They'll surely arrest me. Don't you think it's a bit safer for me to stay here and wait for a camel to come, or maybe somebody to invent a Jeep Cherokee? Really, God, you want me to go there? Do you know where it is? It's 8 miles from Sidon, and Jezebel is from Sidon. Of course, the family and friends are going to be there. I'm going to stand out like a sore thumb. They're going to say, "Oh, there's a priest." They're going to report it to Jezebel. Off goes my head. God, are you sure you want me to go there? I'd rather stay here. And did you say I have to go live there? I'm okay with a weekend. And why don't you send me to a good Jewish grandmother to go stay with? But a Phoenician, if I get to the town, how is she going to know who I am? How are you going to get the message to her? I don't see the reservation. The Wi-Fi is spotty right here. But he's Elijah. He's not me. He lives up to what his name is. Elijah. Can you see what it says? Elijah. Yahweh is my El. The Lord is my God. He has both names of God in his name. Elijah is not just his name. It's a confession of what he stands for. It's a confession of his life. It's a confession that in him is the hope in a situation that is hopeless. And what does he do? He goes. So, he set out. He didn't wait for the camel. He went to Zarephath. When he came to the gate of the town, a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and said to her, "Bring me a little water in a vessel so that I may drink." As she was going to bring it, he called to her and said, "Oh, by the way, bring me a morsel of bread in your hand." We might think it's a bit rude and presumptuous to go to a stranger and say, "Hey, bring me some agua, bring me some bread." But we all know Eastern culture, that it was acceptable, that you had to provide hospitality to the stranger. That's why in John chapter 4, when Jesus gets to the woman at the well, he has no problem asking her for some water. And so nothing wrong with the request, except, but she said, "As the Lord, your God." Why is she saying that? Because she worships Baal and Asherah, the fertility gods of the Phoenicians. She says, "By the name of your God, Yahweh, I have nothing baked. In fact, I only have a handful of meal in a jar and a little oil in a jug. And I'm now gathering a couple of sticks so that I may go home and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." The Hebrew word for widow is the same as English. It means somebody whose husband has died. But there's a second level in the Hebrew language. And that is that somebody whose husband has died and whose source of income has stopped. When you see the word widow in Hebrew, it means the poorest of the poor. Someone who is destitute. Someone who is down and out and has no future. Life is coming to an end. And so what does she do? Who would go to the gate of the city and pick up sticks? I mean, everybody has gone to pick up the big logs and to make a fire. And she goes and picks up the little pieces of wood that nobody else would think of picking up. Why? Because she doesn't need a big fire. She just needs a little one to bake 2 or 3 hot cakes and then wait for death to come. Wait for starvation to set in. This is such a sad part of human history, that starvation has marked a lot of our movement. It continues to mark our movement as humans. We saw 75,000 kids last year arrested on our border, being mailed by their parents with the hope that hopefully their children might have a better future in this country compared to Latin America. This week in HuffPost, they had an article of a few hundred refugees from Syria who had been shipped from Piraeus in Greece to Italy. These Syrian refugees hoping to make Italy, and then these people that ferry them put the boat on autopilot, leave the boat, and just put them on their course, hopefully to land or to whatever. Hundreds have died in the hope of just finding food. The story of Africa, not just food, but clean drinking water. This widow's story is our story today. The suffering and the struggling, we know the figures. Women and their children. The most susceptible to not having food and clean water and a future. But Elijah says, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Go and do as you have said. But first make a little cake of it and bring it to me. And afterwards make something for yourself and your son. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, the jar of meal will not be emptied and the jug of oil will not fail until the day that the Lord sends rain on the earth. She went and did as Elijah said, so that she as well as he and her household ate for many days. The jar of meal was not emptied, neither did the jug of oil fail, according to the word of the Lord that Elijah spoke to her. This is God's living word. May it become living in each of us this day as we hear this and apply it. Earlier, Elijah had gone to Jezebel and Ahab and said to them, be afraid. Be very afraid. You are dealing with the God of Israel. Do not mess with this God. This God will take your crops away, your rain away, and this God will bring you to your knees, that you will have to acknowledge the gods that you worship are just human-made images. They do not exist. And to this widow he comes and says, don't be afraid, for the God of Israel is with you. This God will provide and will not let you alone. When I heard this story as a child in Sunday school, it deeply affected me. How could someone who doesn't believe in Elijah's God blindly trust him? And she goes. She takes the meal, she takes the oil, she mixes it into flour, makes 2 or 3 or 4 hot cakes, and gives it to him. The faith of that woman. It was so astounding that when Jesus did his first sermon in Luke chapter 4, who does he talk about? Yeah, that woman. When he talks to his home congregation, the people that have known him his entire life, he says to them, there's one example of faith that is so tremendous. It's an unnamed Phoenician woman who so believed that God would provide for her that she took her last food and gave it to Elijah. Utter faith. And then she bakes the cakes and she feeds her son. And the next time she goes to empty it, there's flour. And she checks the oil jug, and there's oil. And it happens time and time again. She makes food, and it doesn't empty. It miraculously replenishes itself. And they feast, they eat, they have enough to eat. And instead of waiting to die, they wait for the rain to come, for God to announce the end of the drought. You know what's interesting in this story? God didn't do it for everybody in the town. Only to that one person. It might seem unfair, but I think there's a principle in that Jesus also followed. Jesus didn't heal every sickness and every disease and stop with every person. He did what he could to as many as possible. One family, one individual was blessed through this, and her life changed. This story for me is about feasting in a different way. From their scarcity, they celebrated abundance. Out of nothing, just a bit of a cornmeal and just a little bit of oil. You couldn't make more than 3 or 4 hotcakes from that. They feasted and they celebrated God's abundance. And to be noted here, it's not Elijah who blessed her. It's God. Elijah doesn't do the blessing. It's God who does it. Because both Elijah and this woman acted in faith. Elijah fearing for his life and not knowing where he would end up. And a widow not knowing, would this God actually do what the prophet said and continue to give me food? This meal for me is such an important thing. I think it goes over cultures, it goes over time. This meal bridges our theological and our socio-economical divides and geopolitical divides we have. If we are honestly able to sit down with people in a different faith tradition and have a meal together, would we not hear one another differently? Wouldn't we listen more deeply when I hear somebody when we break bread together? How much hatred was in these two brothers in Paris this past week? What went wrong that they did not hear the loving message of Islam, that Islam is not a religion of violence, but of peace? What went wrong in a 10-year-old boy yesterday when he blew himself up in a market and killed tens of people? Where do we get it so wrong that a Jew and a Phoenician and a Christian and a Muslim and a Hindu and a Buddhist cannot sit together and talk things out? But this is a meal that I think also bridges the divides that we put up as humans. Jew, not Jew. Straight, LGBT. Republican, Democrat. Rich, poor. Home dweller, homeless. Sick, healthy. And something that is so prevalent in our country at this point. Black versus white versus Asian versus Latino. Pastor Dave said last week, invite someone to a meal. Don't invite the usual suspects, because they'll come. Invite Elijah. Invite the widow and her son. Invite someone with whom you have nothing in common, and you might just learn something about them and something about yourself. I want to close. Yeah, the story is about Elijah, and it is about a widow, and it is about their faith, their absolute trust. It is about both of them lacking. Someone who is so righteous, the last one to stand up, and yet his life sucks. You'd think it would be going well with him, because after all, he said yes to God, but it's not going that way. And of a widow and a son who are dying and of starvation. It's a story of connecting with one another and trusting one another. It's a story of discovering that behind the scenes, God was busy at work. And if Elijah had not left the wadi and had not gone to this town, the drought would not have ended. And an entire group of people's lives would not have changed. There's a domino effect. If you take one domino out, it cannot continue to race down the line. It's our story. I see the story of BPC in this, of BPC and our mission partners, our local agencies with whom we work. Most of our agencies do not have a faith component. They do not believe in the God that we worship. And yet over the years, we have found with them that they address the issue of this text, of hunger, of lacking, of poverty and homelessness, of disease, of mental sickness. And that together we go to our partners and say, we come in the name of Brentwood Presbyterian Church, in the name of the God we believe in. How can we partner with you? How can we together make a difference? And I don't want you to ever, ever, ever give up and think that you are doing not enough. Because one family was changed, and that was enough in this story. Not an entire town, not an entire community, not even the Phoenician people. One household. Whether you cook a meal this year, or go out once to Habitat and go build, or go with us to a more, or cook, or clean, or serve, or paint, or dig, or whatever you're going to do. If you do it to one individual or family this year, then you have been 100% successful in what God has given you. And if you can do it to more, praise God for that. But the story is not about Elijah and this widow and BPC. It's about us individually. What is our scarcity? We are the wealthiest people on the face of the planet in terms of human history. And yet we have scarcity. We don't live as people who have abundance. What is our hunger? What is that insatiable thing that drives us, that never feeds us enough, that leaves us empty and hungry? What leaves you parched and thirsty? That whatever you do and you pour it into your career and your life and your family and your relationships, you're always thirsty for more. What are the opportunities that when you take your last hot cake and you offer and you give it away, that it comes back as a blessing in a different way? Who are the people that God needs to send in your life? Whether it be Elijah or whether it be the widow. That it reaffirms your faith. That it reaffirms that God is busy in my life despite how difficult it is going. Where in our lives do we need to see God pour down rain, that the drought can end and I can see fields of plenty? Where does Christ need to come into my life that I can drink deeply from Him and that thirst can go away? Where does Christ need to offer me food that my hunger can be stilled? Where do I need to see God at work in this year? Where do I need to see that I can give in the hope that there will still be left either food or money or resources, whatever I gave away, because God will just continue to bless me? And so my hope and my prayer for us as a church this year is, as we begin 2015, let's keep the story in mind. Open our eyes, God, that we might see you at work. That we can see you in Elijah and in the widow and in the homeless and in the stranger we meet at the market. May the story become our story this year. Amen.